So my name is Ken Shores. I'm a fourth-year PhD student here at Stanford. I work with Sean Reardon and Susanna Loeb. A paper that I had been working on with Kendra Bischoff, who is now a faculty member at Cornell in the sociology department, just got published by Theory and Research in Education. Theory and Research in Education is a journal that does normative papers with an educational focus. So this paper came out of a project with Deborah Satz and Eamon Callan and some other philosophy people for which the Spencer Foundation gave some money for. And so the idea of the paper is there's this kind of like little branch of normative theory called action guiding theory or action guiding philosophy. And action guiding theory is designed to answer questions like, are charter schools a good idea? Would we be justified in prohibiting private schools? Or how many more resources should be given to schools in low-income districts? So they're trying to answer questions that are about what we should be doing. And so questions like this require us to think about two things. And this is an approach that has been suggested by Adam Swift, Sofia Stęplowska, and some other philosophers. And so the two things that this approach asks us to think about are the values and feasibility constraints. And so values are relevant for the questions because they say what values do we have to consider, how should we define those values, and then the harder part is, well, how do we rank the values? So let's say the two values are something like equality and efficiency. And efficiency is how many goods we can produce. And so the question is, well, which of those two values is more important, and how much of one of the values are we willing to trade off to get more of the other value? I'll talk more about that in a second. But then the second piece of the puzzle is this thing called the feasibility constraints. And these are the limitations that exist for realizing those values. So you might think that, equality, perfect equality is the best thing ever. But what we'd really like is perfect equality and lots of resources. But it might not be possible because for some reason maybe people need to be incentivized to work hard. And so you need a little bit of inequality to get people to work harder. And this means that there's a trade-off between equality and efficiency. You have to sacrifice one of those things to get some of the other thing. And so those are the kinds of feasibility constraints that exist, but there are lots of feasibility constraints when we start getting into the specific policy recommendations. So earlier I said, are charter schools a good idea? Well, that depends a lot on what you think charter schools do, and it depends a lot on what effects you think charter schools will have. So the approach has two parts. One is the values part, which is kind of what for philosophers do, that kind of stuff. But the feasibility constraints is something that people haven't done a lot with. And so what we do in this paper is try to kind of unpack what this feasibility side of the problem looks like. And so we just basically call attention to two things. When we talk about what is feasible, you have to say what the assumptions are about what is fixed and not fixed. And you also have to talk about how certain we are about the feasibility estimate that we have. So right now this has all been kind of very vague. So this is one of the figures that we put in the paper, and this is actually a figure that we borrowed from Sofia and Stęplowska, but it's also a figure that you can find in Rawls to a large extent. So like imagine along the bottom axis here is welfare or efficiency. This is how many goods are going to be produced. And then along the y-axis is this thing called equality. This is how much equality there is in the economy. And so these red lines that are going this way are these indifference curves. And these show us what values we have and what values we would consider equivalent. So if you're right here about, then you have this much, a lot of equality and not very much efficiency. And if you're on the same line going this way and you have a lot more efficiency but less equality, you're indifferent between these 2 points. And so Not surprisingly, the further out you go that way will always be better. So our A point is better than the B point. So these are the values rankings, and they're represented by these two indifference curves, I1 and I2. And so the lines that go this way represent the feasibility constraints, and these say, well, what can we actually get to? So F1 says that we can get to any point along this dimension, and so then the best point that you can get to on the lower feasibility constraint is this B point. But if you could actually get more, you would be at this higher up feasibility constraint, and then you could get to this A point. So one of the things that we say in the paper is that if you believe that what you take to be fixed about the world will determine to a large extent whether you're at the higher or the lower feasibility constraint. So if you think, for example, that the world is a very conservative place, and if you tried to pass some policy, the policy would be voted down, like a higher tax rate or spending more money on poor schools, for example, then you might think that you're at this lower feasibility constraint. But you might think that, well, we're going to push for more progressive policies. We're going to push for more progressive funding of low-income schools. And that right now we might be here, but we think that maybe down the road people's preferences for these things are going to change, and they'll be more progressive. And so different people might have different feasibility constraints. And so an example we say in the paper is, maybe a mayor is at this lower feasibility constraint because she has to make decisions that are going to affect her electoral outcomes very quickly. But if you're a Supreme Court justice, maybe you can operate at a different feasibility level because you have a long-term picture in your mind. And so what you take to be fixed will determine to a large extent what feasibility constraint you're at. And so that's one of the points that we make in the paper. And then the second point that we make in the paper is represented by this other figure. So now we just say, okay, we have one solid indifference curve. And this just represents the values that we think are relevant and how we would trade off between equality and efficiency. And then the solid F line represents an agreed upon feasibility frontier. So let's just pretend that this is the feasibility frontier of the mayor. So this is the short-term feasibility frontier. And so the question is something like, well, we want to do some charter schools, and we think that by imposing these charter schools, it might increase inequalities because maybe only the best kids are going to take advantage of these schools, and the schools are better. So you're going to pull apart the distribution. But you might get more out of these kids because they're getting better opportunities in better schools. So there is this trade-off between equality and efficiency. But what we say is that you actually have another kind of problem because we don't really know what effect charter schools will have. So this is uncertainty. So whereas before, I'm going to go back a slide, you got to kind of choose and argue for which feasibility frontier you think is the right one. Here now in figure 2, what we're saying is you don't really get to choose. You have a higher and a lower bound feasibility frontier, and this higher and lower bound are really just a function of the uncertainty that comes along with any time you talk about social science information. The kinds of facts that we want to speak to these problems are estimated with uncertainty, and this uncertainty means that we don't always know what the right amount of information is. So we say there are 3 kinds of uncertainty, and this is just our way of kind of grouping the things together. So one kind of uncertainty is causal uncertainty. Causal just means we want to know what effect did this event have on some outcome. That's the causal piece. The second piece is what we call coarseness. Coarseness is kind of, it's a little harder to explain, but the idea is that we study schools, and we know that schools matter for academic achievement. But that's a very big, it's a big unit. And so when we talk about well, what should we do with schools, it's such a big thing that it introduces lots of complications. But what if the thing that really matters about schools is the teachers? And so instead of thinking about how to get kids into different schools, we can just talk about getting the teachers matched with the kinds of kids that we should match them with. And so that's a smaller unit. It's a finer grained unit of analysis. But then we say, okay, well, it's not really teachers. We want to know what it is about the teachers that matters. So it's either the training they had, or the SAT scores they got in college, or something like that. And so if it becomes something that then you can teach teachers to be better, then we don't have to even move teachers around, which could restrict their liberties and choices about where they want to move, and just make better teachers overall. And so the coarseness thing is about, you can get more precision the more finer grained information you get. And the third kind of uncertainty that we talk about is this thing called contextual uncertainty. And this is a problem that a lot of people have talked about with random experiments. The idea is that you have an experiment or some study in some place, in some time, and then you don't really know if that study that you found over there will work in a different place, in a different time. And so that kind of contextual uncertainty can also cause problems for using empirical information to describe the relevant feasibility constraints. Because if you don't know that it will work in another place in another time, then that can be a lot of uncertainty. So that's how we sort of categorize these things. And so overall then, the big upshot of the paper, we hope, is that we think there's a lot of room for interdisciplinary work between social scientists and normative theorists that can be productive and useful for policymaking. And we suggest a couple things in the conclusion. We say that normative theorists should be mindful of both aspects of feasibility when they discuss real-world limitations. And we also think social scientists should be mindful of the values implicated in their research. This can help focus research questions and also provide more precise descriptions of the world when precision is exactly what is needed to guide policy. So the idea is that social science is trying to make those uncertainty bounds that we described earlier as small as possible, so that way you can really kind of cleanly identify an all things considered best policy that will realize the values that we have.